Good afternoon, as it is here in Germany. Good morning, as it is in North America for Vivek. Am I saying your name right, by the way, Vivek?
Yeah, you've got it. Yeah.
Great, not bad. I'll get other names wrong as we'll soon find out. We've already been chatting about it off air, but at least I'll get your name right. But anyway, good afternoon and good evening if you're in certain parts of Asia. It is a global world that we live in now, and here we are talking to you. What are we here to talk to you about today? Well, obviously tennis, but more specifically, three players who are potentially going to be overtaking the so-called next gen. As you saw in the description, I mentioned Zverev, Medvedev, Thiem et al. Of course, Thiem being a couple of years older, but often gets branded in with those guys that were going to be the threat to the big three that we all know about. But we're skipping them, and we're going to go straight to Felix, Sinner, and Alcaraz, because they have been looming and threatening, particularly this year, but perhaps for the last year or so. And we've got the US Open coming up. And, well, tell me, Vivek, first of all, Vivek, tell me a bit about you.
Well, for me, I've been a huge tennis fan growing up. That's the sport my dad played, and I played some of it as well and loved cricket and soccer or football in your parts. And it wasn't until I came to Canada as a 16-year-old that I really took to basketball, which is what I mainly cover. But I love tennis as much as anyone, and so I'm happy to be on this show covering. And I haven't had the chance to be at the U.S. Open yet, as close as it is to Toronto. But hopefully one day. I was at Wimbledon in 2019. I was working for Yahoo at the time. Yeah, cool. And so it was a pretty incredible experience to be there for the. I was there for the final week of it, and to be there for that Roger Novak final.
Were you at the final itself?
Yeah, 13-12 in the fifth set, that epic match. Yeah. So that was pretty special memory. And then obviously I was there for the women's final as well, when Halep beat Serena in the final. So
yeah, the previous day,
to have watched sort of all the GOATs.
yeah, right.
Because I was also there for the Roger Rafa semifinal.
Me too. Yeah, I was at that one actually as well. Yeah, but I didn't make the final.
That's probably as big a piece of my checklist that I'll knock off.
Definitely. And that was a great, I mean, certainly for the big three, they were in the midst or perhaps towards the end of an era where the three were constantly getting to semifinals. Often one would meet the other, or one would end up meeting two, as Federer did in that particular tournament and couldn't quite skittle the two over. And the one that didn't meet the other one on the way to the final, such as Djokovic that year, would prevail. But anyway, we're not here to talk about the big three. Vivek, what I actually want to speak to you about before we dive into today's topic is, do you have any, inclination towards certain players? Most people who watch me know the kind of players that I have a soft spot for, if you like. But, given the fact that you've lived a large part of your life in Canada, do you tend to find yourself supporting the Canadians?
I definitely do support the Canadians, and it's a good time for that between, Layla Fernandez and Bianca Andreescu, Denis Shapovalov, and of course the guy we're going to talk about, Felix Auger-Aliassime. But growing up, watching that Sampras-Agassi rivalry was a lot of fun, and I became an Agassi guy. I came to love a great return of serve, and so over the years, that's how I became sort of inclined towards Novak Djokovic's game and his incredible return of serve and that backhand. And so I've loved watching him on the court. I know people have their feelings about him and how his playing style. And obviously there's some off-court stuff that I disagree with, but I think in terms of, choosing out of the big three or someone I've enjoyed more than anyone over the last decade plus, it's probably Novak.
Do you play a bit of tennis yourself as well?
I do. Probably more competitively when I was in high school and university. And then it's been recreational since, just sort of with friends whenever I get the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually find myself, I was a big Agassi fan too. The return of serve that he managed to serve up, pun not intended, was always incredible because he was somebody who could return an Ivanisevic serve or even a Sampras, even on grass, which is why he actually he beat Ivanisevic in the final in 92. Sometimes my memory, by the way, for tennis, you'll notice, Vivek, you'll be going, oh, wow, he remembers the year and he remembers the final and that. I'm not bad between about 86 and maybe the year 2000. And then probably from about 2000 to 2006, tennis kind of went down a bit of a black hole. I mean, Murray brought me back in, and we talked about affiliations. And obviously, there's a black hole between when Henman kind of finished and Murray emerged. And that's
fair.
kind of a bit of a hole there, if you like. But anyway, let's bring it back to the present day. And let's even perhaps talk about the immediate or midterm future, because we're here today to discuss three players that I believe actually may well end up. In fact, I'm convinced these three players, if we took, let's take Thiem out of the equation because he's slightly older. Let's also, of course, he's had huge injury problems over the last 2 years, and let's hope that he can get over those. But if you said to me right now, Felix, Sinner, Alcaraz, the amount of majors that they win collectively compared to Zverev, Tsitsipas, and Medvedev, the amount of majors they win collectively, if you can do the mental arithmetic, I'm going for the three that we've got highlighted. And that, let's just say I'll throw out a figure of between these three players, I think they could win between them 20 odd slams plus. I don't see Medvedev, Zverev, and who am I missing? Tsitsipas doing the same. What do you think?
I'm with you, John. I think when you look at where Medvedev, Tsitsipas, and Zverev are in their respective careers, they've already lost some time having to go up against the current big three. That's been the current big three for almost 2 decades.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's one disadvantage they have. Whereas, with Felix and Yannick and Carlito, I think they're coming up at a time where you expect that Roger's already out of the way at this point, and you've got Rafa and Novak very much at the tail end. I would say I'd be surprised if they went on more beyond 2024, and so I think that's an advantage they have that Medvedev and the other two that we mentioned didn't quite have, and so I think that's where they'll probably have that longevity in fighting for Grand Slams. And in general, when you look at tennis players' careers, especially on the men's side, it's usually that 23, 24 age where they start to break through and go on to win big things consistently. And so I think it's leading up to that for these three.
Yeah, right. I think the other thing as well with the other three, I think at least with Sinner, Alcaraz, and Felix, we sort of don't know, and therefore, we're taking not a gamble, but we're like okay with that. The other three have kind of flattered to deceive. We sort of know that Zverev might end up having one match where he just has some terrible service issues, an unbelievable amount of double faults. I mean, I was at the French Open this year where I know he got obviously badly injured. I was at that match. But there was always a feeling that actually a mentally stronger player would have won the first set against Nadal and probably been 2 sets to love up, really. Because actually Zverev had it on his racket. He just couldn't hold it together. Now, Tsitsipas at times has shown similar traits. Earlier on in his career, we'd go, okay, fair enough, when he had his breakthrough at 2019. He beat Federer on the way to the semifinals. But after a couple of years of, okay, fair enough, he's a bit young, that kind of excuse kind of goes out the window. And Zverev, actually, funny enough, coming back to our big three, or our new potential big three, Zverev mentioned it in his speech when he beat Alcaraz in the quarterfinal this year, when he said, I've won today, but I need to win some of these matches because it won't be long before you guys are coming flying past. And in particular, Alcaraz. Let's start with Alcaraz specifically. What have you made of his meteoric rise over the last 12 months and perhaps mini stumble that he's enduring right now?
Yeah, I think his rise is phenomenal. I mean, that two-handed backhand is a thing of beauty. And so I feel like he's got the game, and maybe this mini stumble is just more to do with sort of growing in that mental side. And,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's being up 2-0 on Novak Djokovic at Wimbledon, which is still a tall task to close it out, whether it's, going up against Felix very recently, as we saw in Cincinnati, and not being able to close that out after seeming in control after the first set.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are the things where he'll look at and say, okay, what's going on here? But then there is, between the big three that we're talking about, this potential future big three, there is this interesting sort of jigsaw where we've seen Sinner have the better of the matchup against Alcaraz, and Felix have the better of the matchup against Sinner.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that part of it is fascinating. And, if you had to draw it up over the next decade, you might have things a bit differently. But right now, I think it shows the contrast in styles. I think Felix, when he's able to find that depth with his ground strokes, he's very difficult to beat. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
where some of that consistency still needs to come along. Carlos Alcaraz, again, he's even said it in his social media posts, right? That, hey, this is part of learning and just understanding what comes with all this pressure and expectation. And so whether it really clicks for them next year or the year after that, I think it's probably sooner for Felix, since he's the oldest of the three. But
Yep.
I think with Carlos, there's nothing wrong with this learning period that he's going through now after how good he looked during the clay season.
Yeah, right. I mean, he had a breakthrough slam, if you like, or breakthrough major at last year's US Open. I think he beat Tsitsipas there, and that was a dramatic match. And of course, by the way, Tsitsipas is one of those players that we mentioned that we expect these three people to be flying past. Regarding his year this year, I thought he was very unlucky against Berrettini, and to be honest with you, he could easily have been in the Australian Open semi-finals. He just unfortunately met Berrettini in, I think, the third round. But until then, and by the way, that went to a super tiebreak, so it was super close. But then we see the rise, and he's flying through the rankings, winning ATP 500s, getting to the semi-finals of Indian Wells, where only Nadal was there to stop him in arguably the match of the year in terms of quality. It just probably didn't quite get the same level of attention because it wasn't at a major. But I saw that match between Alcaraz and Nadal, and I was rolling around the sofa just in awe of some of the tennis on display. And then he carried that form on through Miami, winning that title, and also Madrid. But that's where it peaked for him thus far anyway. There's no reason why he can't recover that form next week as the US Open gets underway. But there has been a stumble. Sometimes some of those have been explainable. Like you say, Sinner's been the one really to beat him a couple of times in some big matches recently, notably at Wimbledon. Did you watch the Sinner-Alcaraz match at Wimbledon?
I did. And, I thought that was, again, experience showing where Sinner has been at Wimbledon. We were getting a good look of what Alcaraz could be like on grass, and I thought there were some learning moments for him there, and I thought Sinner was just better prepared for that.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to be at parts of that match. Unfortunately, I had to leave before the concluding fourth set, as it turned out. But what I was surprised. I went into the match thinking Alcaraz was the favorite. I was thinking about an Alcaraz-Djokovic quarterfinal. Sinner had moments this year, but had probably sort of always seemed to hit a ceiling. I remember him losing to Tsitsipas in Australia, and Tsitsipas just wiped him off the court. And I just thought that the Alcaraz's ceiling at that point, as they were at Wimbledon, was slightly higher than Sinner's. So, but maybe you're right. Maybe the matchup is a bit more favorable for Sinner. Of course, he beat him on clay as well a few weeks ago. But back to that match at Wimbledon, I thought Sinner was so solid. And that was probably Alcaraz will be disappointed with how he went out to Zverev at French Open, but really we've seen a bit of inconsistency from Alcaraz in the last few weeks, which perhaps is explainable because of A, his aggressive tennis, but B, and perhaps more importantly, his age. There do seem to be a lot more has been a lot more fanfare regarding Alcaraz and Felix in the way that they play tennis. And you can see how they excite the crowds from their style of tennis. Do you think that sort of is a bit harsh on Sinner though sometimes?
It is, but I feel that's just a part of sport and maybe something that he'll just have to grow accustomed to over time, where people just naturally gravitate towards players who emote and have
Yeah,
that bit of showmanship. And I don't think that's something you would necessarily associate with Sinner. I don't know if that's
no,
something that he'll develop over time, and how natural that would be for him. But you can see that a bit more with Alcaraz and Felix. And so I think that's just, part of their respective packages. And to your point about Alcaraz, a bit of baseball terminology, we see he has that incredible fastball. Or,
yeah,
in cricket, we can say, he's got that stock ball, but it's about, hey, can you develop that leg cutter, off cutter? Can you add some variety to what you're doing?
okay, got it.
And I think we know that when he goes all guns blazing and everything is going his way, he's a freight train. There's
Yeah,
no getting in the way of it. And uh, I think when he learns to play at different tempos over the course of the match and understands that there can be different styles to win each match, especially over a best of five, over 2 weeks at a Grand Slam. And I think that's something that we've seen Novak and Rafa and Roger do over the years, right?
hmm,
It's not like they just play one way over 2 weeks and win a slam. Certain matches, they know they need different tricks in the bag, and they're able to pull it out. And I think that is something that Carlos Alcaraz is going to have to figure out over time.
winning badly is certainly, winning ugly, winning when you're playing badly is certainly something that the big three have all managed to do, which really over the course of 2 weeks and 7 matches is something you have to do. I mean, actually, to be honest with you, I can bring in a soccer or football in the UK, soccer in many other parts of the world. Similar sort of expression, the best teams, win ugly and they win when they're playing badly. And that's how they go on to win titles. And I do think the same applies to tennis. And I think Felix and in particular Alcaraz, who we're focusing on right now, I think that is a thing that does come with maturity. But I tell you, here's a great stat, by the way, and I only heard this morning, and this is in Alcaraz's failure, despite some of these wobbles he's had in recent weeks. Which, by the way, compared to 95% of the tour, they'd be loving the run that he's on. But we're putting Alcaraz in this bracket now. Alcaraz hasn't lost in straight sets all year. So he's pushed every player. He's been losing in 3 sets every time. He's been getting 4s and 5 sets at all the majors that he's exited from. So that's a feather in his cap that he's not getting crushed. Even Nadal, by the way, who's had an incredible 2022. I think he's only lost 4 times. Even he lost in straight sets to Taylor Fritz in Indian Wells. So only Alcaraz can say that, and I think that's something in his favor. Let's have a quick chat about Felix because we haven't really touched on him too much. Felix, of course, is been on the scene probably a year or so longer than the other guys, or maybe even a bit longer than that. I remember having 1 or 2 doubts about him in terms of his aggressive playing style at the US Open a couple of years ago, in that, it was either on or it was off. And I just think that this year he's found some consistency. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm with you there, because I think the big change in his career, in his young career, has been adding Tony Nadal to the coaching staff. And so I feel like that's where some of the maturity has kicked in. They've obviously made the serve a big priority. That was a big concern for me when he was coming up. That serve just didn't seem to match up to the rest of his talent. And so I think the way they've addressed that, he probably had his best serving match of the season against Cam Norrie in Montreal. And so that performance showed that when he has that clicking, then the ground strokes come in, and it's just very, very difficult to beat him. He's had, breakthrough is probably the wrong word, but he's had 2 matches this season that should tell him he absolutely should be in the running to win big titles very soon.
I
One
think.
was
Go on.
the Australian Open against Daniil Medvedev, where he wins the first 2 sets.
Yeah.
Should probably win the match, but Medvedev on a hard court is extremely difficult. And then he pushed Rafa Nadal at the French Open harder than anyone else.
Yeah.
And so I think those 2 performances to me suggest that breakthrough moment, that big title, is closer than some may think.
I'm like you. I do take the positives from those 2 matches in particular. I take a lot of positives from him this year. I'm also a bit like you in that I do. Breakthrough is too strong a word because he's not won a major. He's not even won a Masters title yet. But he did win his first title after a run of loads of final defeats, obviously winning in Rotterdam, also against Tsitsipas. So there is a lot to look forward to. And to be honest with you, apart from probably a slightly disappointing grass court season, because I think of the 3 players, he is the more established on that surface. And of the 3 players that we're talking about today, you would think that he'll probably, if he is to win a major, he may well win Wimbledon before those guys. I'm not saying that Sinner and Alcaraz won't ever win a Wimbledon. I fully expect them to be contending very, very soon at that tournament. But I do think that I remember a tweet from Felix just on the beginning of the grass court season, just after that Rafa match in Paris, and he was on holiday and he said he couldn't wait to be getting on the grass, and he had a grass emoji, and I was really thinking, yeah, I get that. You can take a lot of positives from the year so far, especially from that match against Rafa, where probably on your weakest surface you've pushed the greatest clay court player of all time. I don't think even the most ardent of Djokovic or Federer fans would argue with that. And he was the closest to beating him, as it turned out. Djokovic only pushed Nadal to 4 sets. But then we go into the grass court season, and it was Max Cressy. It's unfortunate. I didn't actually get to see that match, unfortunately, but I did see Felix at the grass court tournaments before Wimbledon, at least on TV. And I just think that that Max Cressy match was so close. Any thoughts on his grass court season?
Yeah, I think it is fair to say that it was disappointing just because of what he's teased on grass so far. Yeah. I think last year he looked very good at Wimbledon, and he only lost to Matteo Berrettini, who went on to the final. So I don't think there's any shame in that. And so you look at this year, I think maybe one thing he'll take from it is that maybe he doesn't need to play 2 grass warm-up events leading into Wimbledon. And maybe, this year, for example, he played both in Germany and the Netherlands. Maybe going forward, he just picks one of them, or he goes to Queens, whatever it may be, and just says, hey, that's all I need. I'm a good enough grass courter to just need that. And maybe just mentally zone in on Wimbledon a bit more. And I think the other theme of this year has been these upset performances out of nowhere. And, I mentioned the match where he looked so good against Sinner and got that win. And then, obviously Borna Coric had the tournament of his life, but you still would have wanted to see more from Felix. In that match. And so I think he's had these performances where he'll look back and think, how do I cut these out, or at least cut down on them, and maintain that consistency where I'm not just a top 8 or a top 10 player, I'm a top 3 player.
Also, that Montreal defeat, having done so well up until that point, I think that, he did a social media post afterwards, kind of apologetic, knowing that he's from Quebec, and I think he's not far away even from the stadium in terms of where he grew up. Correct me if I'm wrong. He knows he's only going to play there every other year because, of course, the tournament switches, albeit, the other one's obviously in Toronto, but his home tournament, and I think that did hurt him.
Yeah, I think because he hadn't had the success he wanted in Montreal prior to this year, to have looked as good as he did against Cam Norrie and then to just completely fall flat in the next match, I think that's what would have been the most discouraging, the most disappointed. And as you mentioned, winning badly, he seemed short of answers or solutions once he realized it wasn't quite his day. And it was
a little bit like some of the things we've been speaking with Alcaraz, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think he's got to look at those situations and say, how do and this is what Novak is the king of, right? On a day where I know I have my B level or C level tennis, how do I build my B game, my C game to a point where it's still good enough to get me through? And
Absolutely,
so
yeah.
for Felix right now, it's still very much, hey, if my A game is there, I'm very difficult to beat. If not, I could lose to anyone. you know.
One more thing on Felix's year, and I know you touched upon it, which was that match with Medvedev in January at the Australian Open, and you're right, a lot of positives can be taken from it. The only thing I sensed, and this is just an amateur watching on TV, and I just wondered if perhaps there was a slight killer instinct missing from there, in that perhaps he was also perhaps actively during the match. I mean, he obviously had match points, super difficult because they were on the Medvedev serve, and I think he produced big serves at the right moment. But I just got the impression that he was kind of okay with losing that match. And that's to be praised when we look at the ways other young players react to defeats, and then they go on a spell of defeats. And Shapovalov obviously springs to mind there, and we see so I get that there's a balance that needs to be struck, but I still would have liked to have seen him going into that fifth set. I just had a feeling that he was maybe a bit too relaxed, and he was like, do you know what? I've done well. I've gone as far as I can. I've pushed the best hard court player in the world at the time, and arguably still now, given that Djokovic obviously wasn't there in Australia in January. And I just wondered if he maybe accepted defeat a little too easily that day, and it was there for the taking, possibly more so than it was against Rafa on clay. Rafa on clay, Philippe Chatrier, we all know that story. And I think Felix was still excellent in that fifth set. And also, don't forget, Felix was 2-1 down, and it looked like Rafa was going to seal it in four. Felix gets unbelievably wins the fourth set. And actually, Felix's level doesn't drop in that fifth. It's actually Rafa that just rises to the occasion, as we know he can. So we've done a lot on Felix. We've done plenty on Alcaraz. Perhaps as I said to you before, the guy who kind of has been
Sorry,
under the
before
radar.
we go on,
Go
can
on.
I just add a final point
Absolutely.
on what you were saying about Felix, specifically with that Medvedev match, and something that I feel is a theme for him is I think he just outthinks himself sometimes,
Okay.
and he just gets into his head a bit too much, and sometimes less thinking and more doing is better. And I think there's a very subtle difference when your opponent is on song and you're thinking, how do I beat this version of my opponent, versus saying, he can't beat my best. And I think in that match, you saw a bit of that helplessness where he's looking at Medvedev reaching his peak level and Felix saying, oh, I don't know if I can match this, as opposed to really believing him in himself and saying, no, my best is better than his. I showed that over the first two sets, and I'm going to be at that level again.
Yeah, right. I mean, actually, there's always peaks and troughs in a match, and you can beat your peak for two sets, and then maybe slightly off it for one of, but then it's then getting back that losing the momentum, but then regaining it. And I think in many sports, but possibly tennis more than any, it's one of the most difficult to get it back, which is what makes some of these matches when a guy goes 2-0 up, then it's back to two sets all, and yet that person still goes on to win the fifth. I think is one of the most remarkable and hardest things to do. So, and as it was, Medvedev prevails in the match. But I will say, let's put a little positive end on it. I think, with the exception of maybe his grass court season, and even really, we're just really talking about the match against Max Cressy, which is super hard in the first round to have. He wins that match, and he could well have had a great run. In fact, I'm pretty sure he would have done. But really, he's kind of done as well as you would expect. He lost, as you said, to Medvedev. He lost to Nadal, and he's won his ATP 500. If he goes on and has an amazing US Open, i.e. goes deep, quarters, semis, or further, then we'll be looking at a great body of work from him for this year. And hey, listen, if the draw's kind, who knows? He could even be in the final in a couple of weeks from now. So we've done quite a bit on Felix. We've done quite a lot on Alcaraz. We've been excited about them at various points this calendar year in particular. Somebody who kind of slips under the radar when it comes to these three players, or even tennis players in general anyway, partly because of his undemonstrative style, partly because perhaps he doesn't take to social media. I mean, both of these players, but Alcaraz in particular. I saw Alcaraz during Wimbledon, great posts of him in some house, I guess, nearby, and having breakfast, and post supporting other players as well. I've seen some nice tweets from Alcaraz about Pablo Carreño Busta this last couple of weeks, and one or two other Spanish players too. So we see these guys and they've got the charisma, but Sinner is a bit more understated. Tell me what you think about him, and tell me about, for example, do you think that potentially right now he's possibly even ahead of these two in terms of the US Open coming up that begins on Monday?
I think that's a fair statement. I think he'll be right there with Felix. I think it'll all depend on how the draw shakes out, and which of the two has the better odds based on that. I think with Sinner, this may be a strange thing to say, but because of that lack of showmanship and demonstrativeness, I almost feel like the mental aspect is most important to him of the three, because I think he is going to find himself in matches against the other two, whether it be Alcaraz or Felix, where he won't necessarily have that support. And it might be, heavily tilted towards, he might be a bit like Djokovic in that way. And so needing that mental steel, needing that solidity in tough moments. And that's what we saw at Wimbledon. So he's obviously capable of it in that matchup against Alcaraz. And I think if he can take a page out of that and go forward, I think that will be huge for him. But that's what I feel about Sinner at this point in time, where I think everything suggests that people lean towards the other two. And so can he find that inner will to ignore all of that?
Which one of the three do you favor to go furthest at this year's US Open? It's tricky, right?
Yeah. I mean, without the draw, I would still say Felix.
Okay.
Just because I think it's been a really good year overall for him. We saw him get to the semis last year. And, obviously he was beaten extremely convincingly by Medvedev there. But again, to take those lessons and then come back this year and be a better player for it, I think this is where you could see him make a big run. And then with Alcaraz, I think he's just in a period of learning. And so I think unless the draw really shakes out in his favor, which it might because of his high seeding and the possibility of Djokovic not being in there either. So I think Alcaraz, unless the draw really shakes out in his favor, I would go with Felix.
Yeah, I think I would probably agree with you. Again, it's partly this understated thing with Sinner that of the three, I expect him to be solid. I expect him to be good. That's not to say he's not an exciting player, but there'll be players I expect Sinner to beat, and he will. And then it'll get to a point if, for example, Sinner is playing Alcaraz in say a quarterfinal, I would still fancy Alcaraz like I did at Wimbledon, albeit I got it wrong. Probably like I would have done if I'd have thought about it for that clay court match recently. I forget where it was now, but somewhere in that European clay court mini season that reemerges after Wimbledon. And but there's still something about I think also Alcaraz hard court probably slightly better than he is on grass. This is his first Wimbledon this year, of course. It's his second Wimbledon, but his first one as a serious player, if you like. So I would, and Alcaraz, of course, had a good US Open last year, and Sinner, he did okay, but I'm just trying to think who Sinner went out to Zverev last year, and that's it. So Sinner gets to Zverev, as I think it was it Zverev Sinner lost to last year? I'm pretty sure it was at the US Open, and Sinner gets to Medvedev, Felix lost to Medvedev. So whenever Sinner gets to a slam and he comes up against, these players, he loses, and whether it's Tsitsipas, that defeat in Australia was quite jarring, I thought, at the time. Now, he's recovered since then. I would say he's had a great 2022 since that Tsitsipas defeat. But I went into that match thinking Sinner's got a chance here. I thought it was 60-40, but Tsitsipas blew him away in possibly Tsitsipas's best match of the year. But yeah, that took me by surprise, if you like, and made me think, okay, can Sinner reach the absolute top levels that the three players that are not a part of this podcast, if you like, and I know Medvedev can produce an unbelievable level. I know that Tsitsipas can produce, and Zverev too, albeit obviously Zverev will be absent in the US. And the top level I've seen from Sinner, certainly at majors, hasn't been quite at those three level, and even hasn't probably replicated Felix or especially Alcaraz. So if Alcaraz plays Sinner, unless, depending on how, of course, the tournament goes. And I always think with predictions, there's kind of three moments. There's pre-draw, which is where we are right now. There's post-draw, and things can open up and that can change everything, as we know. Then there's also a sort of a mid-tournament prediction, if you like, which obviously should be the most accurate, which is once you've seen them play in the first 2 or 3 rounds, then, of course, you can reevaluate. I mean, French Open this year is a good example where the draws seem to open up for Tsitsipas from day one when you have Alcaraz, Zverev, Djokovic and Nadal all on one half and Tsitsipas on the other. But then the way the first 2 or 3 rounds went for Tsitsipas, it's like, boy, he's hanging on here. He's struggling to get through against very lowly ranked players that, he ended up coming a cropper against Holger Rune. So then it's really, for me, it's either Felix or Alcaraz. And by the way, Felix or Alcaraz could also go out in round 3, if they come up against Coric or whatever, who's in the form of his life.
Yeah,
that could also happen. But yeah, I guess Felix. I just wonder though, with Alcaraz could pull it out. Alcaraz plays Medvedev in a quarterfinal or semi-final, and depending on how things have gone, but Alcaraz could win that match. I'm just not sure if Felix has quite got that mental strength here. Am I being too harsh on Felix?
I think he has had enough of those down performances for it to still be a question mark. And, sometimes I wonder if he almost needs that huge moment, even if it comes with a bit of a fortuitous draw, for him to really believe in himself on that level. And, Roger, obviously one of the greatest of all time. But when I look back at the start of his career, it took him a long time to break through.
Yeah.
And even the Wimbledon that he won, if you go down the matches of who he beat, the draw worked out in his favor. He beat Mark Philippoussis in the final.
Yeah.
Who was ranked about, just inside the top 50 at the time. And so I think things worked out for Roger in that way, where now he has a Wimbledon in his bag. It doesn't matter who he beat to get it, but now he believes in himself on that level. Absolutely. And then we saw what he went on to accomplish from there. I'm not saying Felix needs 1 to get to 20. I'm saying if Felix gets 1, he might live up to the hype of potentially being a multi-slam winner, of winning maybe 5 or 6, or being a part of the 3 that in total get to the 20, as you suggested, combined.
Yeah. We're looking at 6 players now in a way, and from 2 slightly different generations. I think amongst those 6, because let's say just putting Thiem to one side, amongst those 6, only 1 has a major. Now, that's only 1 is still, 2 or 3 of these players have only been on the scene for a couple of years, but 1 has a major, and that is Daniel Medvedev, and he's also been in the final of 2 others. So we sort of, I think, as you mentioned with Federer, I think the faith in someone who knows how to do it, and that applies to other sports too, and especially tennis. Once Federer got that, it was like, okay, I know how to win big matches, and I know how it feels on match point, or how it feels when you're serving for the title, etc. And that stood Federer in great stead, which is why he won 5 Wimbledons back to back, as well as many other titles. And we don't know that about the other 5. And so I guess unsurprisingly, both with the bookmakers and me personally, if you're putting me to amongst these 6 players, albeit that obviously Zverev will be absent, I would put my money more on Medvedev right now for the US Open. Is that fair?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, he's won the tournament. He has arguably been the best hard quarter of the last couple of seasons. And so you have to give him that respect. I think if especially if he just closes out the deal against Rafa at the Australian Open final, we're looking at him, I think, even more differently on a hard court surface.
And even more differently regarding, and that's how it is, just 1 point, 2 points regarding his career and certainly his year, that transforms his year. Because I mean, lots of people have pointed to that moment when Medvedev is on the verge of breaking Rafa in the third set, and he hasn't really been the same since. I mean, Nadal crushed him in Acapulco. He didn't threaten at all during the Sunshine Double. Clay, obviously, then he was injured as well. I should say, actually, so I'm not sure if he performed in the Sunshine Double. So I don't want to be too harsh on him there. But of course, Clay not being his surface, and he didn't really reemerge until the end of the season, and then being banned from Wimbledon. But also, there've been many other tournaments where he didn't quite perform. And really, I know he's won a title recently, but there are some question marks regarding him. But 5 sets, majors. We know that he's been in the final of the US Open in 2019. He was in the Australian Open in final twice as well. So actually, he's been in 4 finals and he's won 1. But of course, he's always come up against one of the GOATs in each of those finals. But we know he can do it. So, by the way, a completely off the wall comment here from Trishan, which sounds like something more common in North America or the US than the UK. But apparently, the woman is going to sue Nick Kyrgios about the 700 drinks accusation, which reminds me of a kind of a situation in the US where McDonald's gets sued for serving hot coffee. Which, by the way, I'm going to be in New York in a couple of weeks, and one thing, New York is famous for food and also for coffee and pizza and all the rest of it, and large Italian community. I think the coffee tastes great in New York, but sometimes it could be a little bit on the hotter side. It does sort of, if you don't start drinking it immediately, it's cold. And I wonder if, and I've off on a crazy tangent there, but I would like to, New York, if you could just increase the temperature a little bit of the coffee when I arrive in a couple of weeks. I booked my flight yesterday, so I'll be there for the latter stages, hopefully to see some great matches. Vivek, have you ever been to the US Open?
No, I have not. I hope to sometime in the future, but at this point, I have not. I've been to the Australian Open and I've been to Wimbledon. So I've got the French Open and the US to knock off in terms of the slams. Sure. Obviously, I've been to what used to be the Rogers Cup is now the National Bank Open in Toronto a bunch of times. So lucky to have it so close. But, you mentioned Nick, and with all the discussions we've had, it would not surprise me if he showed up and won this tournament.
Really? Do you really think he's got a chance? I mean, I think he's got a chance, but
I think so. I think the way he's played, I think the confidence he's gained from Wimbledon, the maturity that he seems to be playing with, obviously the stuff that's happening off the court is something I don't support at all or condone or I'm extremely against. And so hopefully that is something that is handled appropriately by the authorities. But on the court, he'll be at the tournament, and I think he will have as good a chance as any, because I think he's looked that good, pretty much since Wimbledon.
Yep. I mean, I just wonder if Wimbledon is the one that's most likely for him, partly because of perhaps because of a lack of contenders. Perhaps. I mean, I think this US Open on both the men's and the women's side is arguably the most open in a decade.
And let's not forget he beat Medvedev.
Yeah, he did. He did recently. Yeah, he did. And so that's a big win for him, because I think he lost to Medvedev in Australia, which we kind of would have expected despite him being on home territory there, Kyrgios. But now you would go into that match thinking, but again, I come back to this thing of, which I know you touched on, of just Medvedev has been there and done it. And Nadal, of course, has been there and done it 22 times. So you would go into that match making both of them the favorite. But, depends on how they perform before that. Do you have a particular favorite slam that you really look forward to watching? I mean, obviously we're talking about more on TV here, but among the four majors, is there one that you have a slight preference for in terms of watching?
I love Wimbledon. I've always loved Wimbledon, and all the tradition that comes with it. Uh, I think that's probably number one. It's probably where I have the most memories, whether it's watching Pete Sampras win over and over, or watching Henman try to get past him, watching Goran Ivanisevic win as a wild card. That's an incredible memory of mine, and so I'd probably put that number one. I love the energy of the U.S. Open crowd. That New York crowd is something special. It adds a completely different element to the other slams. So that is probably number two for me. Australia, as much as I love it, the time zone makes it very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yeah.
matches are on, the final, for example, is always on at 3 or 4 in the morning. And so a lot of good memories because Novak has been so good at that tournament.
Yeah.
But time-wise, it's always a challenge. What about you?
I think I've got a soft spot for the US Open, and I'm not just saying that because it's on the horizon. I think a lot of it depends on where you're from, where you grow up, and all that. But funny enough, you would therefore expect me to say Wimbledon. But I think because when you're traveling to a tournament, it's kind of quite exciting to go somewhere that's a bit further away, but not too far away. That's the problem with Melbourne. It's just a long way to go and a lot more effort and a lot more expense. Whereas New York, you could do a sort of lengthy from London or from most Western European cities. You can do a sort of a long weekend, sort of 4, 5, 6 days, if you like, which I've done many times and I'll be doing again this year. I remember going to New York in 2019 and doing exactly that. I think I arrived Saturday morning, actually, and stayed until maybe Tuesday or Wednesday, as in the weekend of the final. I remember nervously having the semi-finals, which was Nadal, Berrettini, and Medvedev against, I think, either Khachanov or Dimitrov in the other one. I think it was Dimitrov. And just thinking I won a Nadal Medvedev final to go and see. And that was on the Friday evening here. And I had to leave midway through those matches and go off to the airport. And I just remember thinking, please don't be an underwhelming final. And unfortunately, it was amazing, that Medvedev and Nadal final, and didn't disappoint. So that's something. There is another thing about New York, though, that I quite like. Some people in the UK in particular can be a bit sniffly about the crowd and making a noise and blah, 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 because they're very familiar with how it is at Wimbledon. But I like that. I like that the tickets seem to be a bit more available to the community at the US Open. Certainly in the early stages of the tournament, you will get a bit more of a varied crowd there. It's in a part of New York that's certainly no Wimbledon, shall we say. I like that. I remember my first US Open was 2016. By the way, I say first US Open. It sounds like I've been to about 25, but I've only been to 2. 2016 and 2019. But when I was there on the first day or the first evening, there was Phil Collins was opening because they had the roof coming over, and he did 3 songs. And then they had Djokovic playing that evening, and Djokovic did a little song after the match, and that was fun. He did a bit of I Can't Dance to remember Genesis and all that stuff. And I just remember the atmosphere was great. And I also remember, like I say, just families of all different backgrounds being there in the stadium. And of course, they don't necessarily know that at Wimbledon, by the way, we keep quiet 95% of the match, and we sort of applause occasionally and occasionally get into it and, spend €20 on or £20 on strawberries and cream. But, that's I want tennis to open up as much as possible to the world. And I think it's been some nice landmark wins from certain people of certain nationalities this year, and long may that continue. And I think, therefore, I have a particularly soft spot for New York. I think culturally, Roland Garros tends to be a bit closer to Wimbledon in terms of it's in a very nice part of Paris, etc. Although I would probably go for Roland Garros over Wimbledon, at least to the eye of what I'm seeing in terms of the tennis, just because sometimes some of the matches can be a bit boring at Wimbledon with the serve bots doing so well and so on. But that has got better, by the way, as the technology and the balls seem to have slowed, and the grass court has got a bit slower over the last 2 decades, and players from the back of the court, such as Djokovic and Nadal and Federer, can succeed. And then there's Australia, but that's just a very long way. I think there's a bit of and this does apply to tennis in general, but it does seem to be a bit stronger at probably Wimbledon and Australian Open. I've only been to Australian Open once, but many friends of mine have been a lot more often, and they say it's a lot more corporate and a lot stricter. We saw the stuff with the Peng Shui t-shirts, for example, in Australia, and certain other things, getting your camera out and that kind of thing is heavily policed. So that leaves an impression. But so therefore, New York does it. And yes, perhaps they probably shouldn't, celebrate double faults or cheer as people are about to serve. But we saw that in Australia too. But I think with the exception of that, I'm all for, having fun and being as loud as you want at a tennis match. I mean, at the end of the day, football players take penalties with 80,000 people screaming and shouting, and they've got to get things pretty accurate in that moment, as English players in particular can testify to. Any thoughts on what I've said about New York or any other slams?
I'm with you on pretty much everything. And the one thing I will say about Australia is I was there in 2015, and I went for the quarterfinals between Djokovic and Raonic.
Okay. Nice.
And I was probably the only Canadian in there rooting for Novak. And I was there as a fan, and I had a really good time. And the tickets were not overly expensive from what I remember. And the one thing, if I do remember this correctly, was you buy a seat, and the section, at least that I was in, was first come, first serve. So it wasn't that you were assigned to a particular row or seat. It was just you show up early enough, you can be front row, that type of thing. And so I thought that was cool and interesting and different. And yeah, I had a good time, was able to go around the grounds, and actually bumped into a couple of players. I have a picture with Nick Kyrgios because I bumped into him.
Very young Nick Kyrgios.
Yeah. And so... yeah, I agree with pretty much everything you said there. With New York, yeah, I'm looking forward to it being energetic and fun. And actually, one point I did want to bring up was the point you made about the crowd. When Kyrgios played Hubie Hurkacz recently, the crowd was getting into it, and instead of waiting for the crowd to mellow down, Kyrgios is the server, and he could sort of spot that Hurkacz wasn't quite ready, and he just went ahead and served. And it was an ace. And Hubie was a bit annoyed, but at the same time, it was like, you got to play to the server, and if he doesn't have a problem with the noise, then it's fair game.
You've got to play to the server speed, absolutely. And as somebody who plays at a very low level, but likes to play quite often, as I'm quite ready to serve, it's kind of annoying as I see the receiver just sort of messing around or still with his back to me or whatever. And I'm just thinking, it's not like I'm serving really quickly between points. It's still quite annoying. And I wonder, with a certain Spaniard from Mallorca as well, I actually think this is, people talk about him, him taking time between points as a server. But I think probably as a server, what I would be most annoyed about with Rafa is the time he needs to prepare to receive this. So many I've never seen a player, he has his arm in the air more than a defender calling for offside, as he wants to hold the play, either because something's distracting or he just needs another minute or another few seconds, sorry. And really, the server is well within their rights. And I actually also think there's a bit of an aura there, and it's Rafa, especially if you're a young Spaniard, but whoever you are, we know that certain players have cats and dogs and various things named after the Spaniard. And so, Korda, obviously, Korda, by the way, going to be unseeded. And I was just looking at some sort of next-gen players, of course, and certain generations in the last 5 or 6 years. He's certainly somebody who most of these players, including the players we've mentioned, will want to avoid. But yeah, listen, Vivek, where can we find you on social media and in the world at large?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter, on Instagram at Vivek M. Jacob. That's VIVEKMJACOB. And you'll see all things NBA, Manchester United, the Premier League in general, football in general, soccer for those watching from North America, and a lot of tennis, especially I mainly focus on the Masters events and the Grand Slams, just because I'm watching all these different things. But yeah, I love my tennis.
I actually want to just quickly get a couple more questions on you, because actually Martin is someone I went to uni with, and I haven't seen him for 20 odd years, but we've crossed each other's paths. And he's got a good question here, actually, about a player that we haven't touched on today, at least. I mean, not exactly next gen or next gen or now gen. Well, will Murray ever make the second week of a Grand Slam? What do you think?
I think it's going to be tough, just because with where his game is at, you can't see him moving too far up the rankings. And so in that first week of the Slam, I just feel he's bound to get that one matchup that is just going to be too uphill of a challenge. And so I think it's just about appreciating whatever, few wins that he may have left in him at a Grand Slam event. And then hopefully he's able to just say goodbye on his terms.
I think I'll be a bit more optimistic than Vivek. I think he can, but it's all about the draw. And of course, he's been desperate. He's been talking about the last few months about finding consistency and hopefully getting a seeding. But he needs to obviously break into the top 32, albeit that with one or two players absent, sometimes 34. And I know it's fine margins, but it can make a difference. And I was thinking that this year with Wimbledon, if he could have had a good run before Wimbledon, with obviously the absence of Russians and Belarusians, that, something like 40th or 45th in the world would have been enough for a seeding. But he needs a kind draw, if you like, and maybe one or two players to drop out. But all of these things can happen, and you can suddenly, before you know it, be in the third or fourth or fifth or quarterfinal. And the one thing that has been added, though, to the doubt, I think, has even occurred in the last couple of weeks, cramping as much as he has with 3-set matches that have gone the distance like they did last week. And it was great to see him and Wawrinka go toe-to-toe, reminding us of years gone by. But I wonder if that's a big issue as well. If 5 sets. I mean, I know he beat Basilashvili in 5 sets at the beginning of the year, but Basilashvili, we know that it can very much blow hot and cold, and I think he largely blew cold that day. So yeah, that's the quick thing on Murray. Thank you very much. I've got one more thing, Vivek, and I know I've grabbed you for a while, but I know we've been talking about men's tennis a lot, but I just want to have one question about a Canadian female player. Andreescu can wait for another day. We love Andreescu, but I want to have a quick question and a quick thought on Layla Fernandez. Can we see any heroics from her in the next couple of weeks?
I don't think so. I wasn't encouraged by what I saw both in Toronto and Cincinnati. And I think that it's just been a bit too soon since the injury. And I think she's just dealing with a bit of that. And, she's very young. So I think there is that impatience that you see in her, that frustration that, hey, why am I not able to play the way I'm capable of? And so I think the US Open is coming just a bit too soon since the injury. And so, I'll be happy if she can make the second week.
Yeah. I mean, I actually see probably maybe her and Maria Sakkari are the two players on the women's side. I'm not optimistic about either of their chances for various different reasons, but I'd love to see those two go far for very different reasons. Listen, Vivek, thank you very much for your time. It's been great having you on board, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you so much for having me, John. Look forward to it.
Thank you. Take care.